Imagine being thrown in jail, not for stealing or lying, but for wearing the wrong color toga or for laughing at a funeral. Imagine laws so bizarre that even modern societies would find them absurd. Yet in ancient Rome, they weren't just rules, they were the law, enforced by the state and sometimes punishable by death. Welcome to the strange, shocking, and surprisingly strict world of Roman law. The streets of Rome were alive with voices, the clatter of carts over cobblestones, and the distant hum of the Forum, where senators debated, merchants shouted, and citizens navigated a society bound by centuries of tradition and law. But beneath the grandeur of temples and arches lay a legal system so intricate, so pervasive, that even the most mundane aspects of daily life were controlled by statutes, laws that could bewilder the modern mind. Take, for example, the Lex Julia de Adulteris, a law concerning adultery. Today, we might think of adultery as a moral failing or a personal issue, but in Rome, it was a crime, punishable by exile or even death in extreme cases. What's more, the law didn't treat men and women equally. A married man could have extramarital affairs with slaves or prostitutes without punishment, but married women were monitored strictly, and any violation could destroy their family's honor and property rights. It was a world where gender and social class dictated who could break the law and who could not. But some laws were even stranger. The Lex Appia, passed during the Second Punic War, forbade women from possessing more than a small amount of gold, wearing multicolored garments, or riding in carriages in the city of Rome, except during religious festivals. The law was intended as a wartime austerity measure, a way to save resources, but it quickly became a source of resentment. Women protested, arguing that it curtailed their freedom, and eventually the law was repealed. But for decades, Roman women had to dress modestly, as dictated by the state. Then there were laws concerning speech, behavior, and even laughter. The Romans, obsessed with dignity or dignitas, had rules for public conduct. Laughing during a solemn ceremony could be considered disrespectful and punishable. Speaking out of turn in the Senate could earn not just scorn, but fines or removal from office. Even walking in certain parts of the city at night could be illegal for citizens, particularly if they were suspected of plotting political intrigue. One of the most peculiar statutes concerned burials and funerals. Romans were extraordinarily concerned with ritual and propriety, believing that disrespecting the dead could invoke the wrath of the gods. It was illegal to bury your dead inside the city walls, except in designated areas, and elaborate tombs were heavily regulated. In fact, the size and decoration of a tomb could be a legal issue. Too grand and neighbors could sue you for ostentation. Too modest and the family could be shamed. These laws reflected a society obsessed with social hierarchy and public perception, where even death had to be controlled by legal decree. Food, too, was regulated by law. The Lex Fania restricted extravagant banquets for citizens of Rome, attempting to curb excessive spending that could disrupt social order. Romans were expected to show restraint, and hosting a feast with too many exotic foods could land a person in legal trouble. Imagine being fined because your dinner party served more than 3 courses of imported delicacies. And then came the laws about personal appearance. The sumptuary laws dictated what people could wear, what colors were permitted, and even the types of jewelry allowed. Purple, for example, was reserved for the emperor and his close circle. Anyone else caught wearing it risked severe punishment. Hairstyles, too, could be a matter of law. Women of certain social classes had to adhere to prescribed styles, and even men's beards were subject to regulation during particular periods. It was a society where your clothing and grooming were not just fashion choices, they were statements of legality and loyalty. But what drove these strange, often oppressive rules? The Romans were obsessed with order, hierarchy, and social stability. Laws were not merely for punishment, they were meant to reinforce societal norms, distinguish classes, and prevent chaos.
In a city that could swell to over 1 million people at its height, maintaining control over appearance, behavior, and property was essential for the ruling elite. Yet behind every law, no matter how bizarre, there were stories of ordinary Romans trying to navigate the system. A young man might risk wearing forbidden colors to court a woman. A clever merchant might exploit loopholes in trade regulations. A widow might defy restrictions on mourning attire to honor her deceased husband. These stories reveal a society not just of rigid laws, but of human ingenuity, defiance, and sometimes tragic consequences. This is just the opening glimpse into the weird world of Roman law. In the next part, we can dive deeper into the most shocking examples, like laws regulating children and family behavior, punishments for tax evasion, gambling, and false prophecy, how Roman law influenced daily life, commerce, and religion in ways that would baffle us today.
The streets of Rome thrummed with energy, yet beneath the bustle, the shadow of the law stretched into every corner of daily life. No citizen could claim ignorance. Rome's statutes were everywhere, from the marketplace to the family home, from the forum to the temples. And the further one delved into these rules, the stranger they seemed to modern eyes. Take, for instance, laws concerning children and family behavior. Romans believed that proper upbringing was not just a personal matter, but a civic duty. Fathers, or paterfamilias, held almost absolute authority over their households. They had the legal right, known as patria potestas, to control the lives of their children, including the power to sell them into slavery or even execute them in extreme cases. While this power was rarely used to its fullest extent by the late Republic, it underscores how deeply legal authority penetrated the family unit. Yet the law could also be unexpectedly prescriptive in ways that seem trivial today. For example, the Lex Papia Poppaea, a law designed to encourage marriage and procreation, imposed financial penalties on those who remained unmarried or childless. Conversely, married couples were rewarded with privileges and tax breaks. This law was part of Augustus's ambitious plan to regulate private life for the perceived good of the state. Citizens' bedrooms, it seemed, were subject to legislation. Then there were the laws about property and commerce, which could be downright bizarre. A man could be fined, or worse, if he built a house that blocked his neighbor's sunlight, or if he allowed trees on his property to encroach on public land. Some laws even dictated how far a person could extend a balcony or a fence. Roman architects and merchants had to navigate a labyrinth of legal restrictions that dictated not only what they could own, but how they could use it. Roman law also had a strange fascination with games, gambling, and prophecy. Gambling was technically illegal for citizens, yet it remained wildly popular. The law imposed fines on those caught playing dice for money, but enforcement was uneven. More severe were the laws against false prophecy, because Romans believed that deceitful seers could undermine public order or invite the gods' wrath. Anyone caught pretending to predict the future could face banishment or execution, a grim reminder that superstition and law were inseparably intertwined. Perhaps most shocking were the laws concerning slaves, whose lives were almost entirely subject to their masters and the law. Under Roman statutes, a slave had no legal personhood and could be tortured or executed for minor infractions. Yet, paradoxically, some laws protected slaves from particularly cruel treatment, mainly to prevent social unrest. Masters were discouraged from killing slaves without cause because a rebellious population of slaves could threaten entire estates and even the city itself. And there were bizarre instances of slaves being granted temporary freedom for exceptional service, only to return to bondage after a festival, a legal loophole that underscores the complexity and occasional absurdity of Roman legislation. Religion, too, was tightly bound to legal decree. Certain ceremonies, sacrifices, or festivals had mandatory legal observances, and failing to participate, or doing so improperly, could be considered an offense against the gods and the state. For instance, Roman magistrates were expected to perform religious duties before political actions, ensuring that laws and government operations had divine sanction.
A magistrate who neglected this could face fines or public humiliation. Even public laughter or disrespect during sacred rites could lead to arrest. And yet, amidst all this rigidity, Romans were cunning in their interpretation and sometimes outright defiance of the law. Stories abound of citizens finding loopholes, merchants manipulating weights and measures, young men flaunting sumptuary restrictions through subtle fashion tricks, or families bending marriage regulations to maintain wealth and influence. Law was everywhere, but life always found a way to bend it. Consider the curious case of a senator's wife, forbidden by law to wear gold jewelry exceeding a certain amount. She reportedly stacked thin gold threads into her hair, technically staying within legal limits while appearing extravagantly adorned. Or the young Roman who defied the lex oppia by dressing in forbidden colors, but argued he was attending a religious festival, a claim that saved him from prosecution. These examples reveal that while the laws were severe, ingenuity and social cunning often determined one's fate. By the end of the Republic, Roman law had become a vast, intricate web, a mixture of tradition, social control, moral guidance, and practical regulation. Some statutes were designed to preserve the state, others to dictate morality, and a few existed simply because the Romans could codify absurdity into law. For the modern observer, these laws are shocking not just because they're strict or peculiar, but because they reveal a society where the ordinary rhythms of daily life were inseparable from the authority of the state.
As night fell over the bustling streets of Rome, the city's grandeur hid a peculiar truth. The lives of its citizens were governed by rules so strange they could make even the most disciplined modern society gasp. The Romans, ever obsessed with control, extended their laws into areas most would consider absurd or deeply personal. Take public hygiene. Romans were famous for their baths, but these were not just social spaces, they were regulated by law. Public bathhouses had strict rules. Men and women were often segregated, and behavior was monitored closely. Bathers could be fined for bringing unauthorized items, causing disruptions, or failing to follow cleanliness protocols. In some cases, people were legally punished for spitting or relieving themselves in the wrong place, even if it was an accident. The Romans believed that hygiene was both a civic and moral duty. Disorderly conduct in such spaces was considered a threat to public order. Even something as private as relieving oneself had legal consequences. Laws dictated where and how citizens could relieve themselves. Public urination in the wrong place could result in fines, and worse, repeat offenders could be publicly humiliated, a punishment designed to teach respect for civic space. Latrines were state-regulated, and some public toilets even had attendants to ensure order. In Rome, even your bladder could be under scrutiny. Speech, satire, and poetry were equally dangerous. The Romans were masters of wit, but legal statutes were quick to punish misuse. Criticizing magistrates or the emperor could be considered criminal libel, and satirical poets risked fines, exile, or worse. The famous poet Juvenal famously skirted trouble by carefully crafting his biting satires, but others were not so lucky. A poorly timed insult, a sarcastic comment about a magistrate's wardrobe, or a joke about the gods could land a citizen in prison. Humor, it seemed, was a risky enterprise. Some laws even regulated mourning. Romans were obsessed with propriety during death and funerals. Citizens could be fined or face public shame if they cried too loudly, laughed inappropriately, or wore incorrect garments during ceremonies. Grief was not just a personal emotion. It was a social performance, codified by law. One wealthy family reportedly faced censure for over-decorating a tomb, which violated sumptuary principles regarding funeral displays. Too little respect was scandalous, too much was illegal ostentation. Then came the strangest laws of all, those concerning color, clothing, and jewelry. Romans codified who could wear what, down to the color of their garments and the number of layers or rings. Purple, the color of emperors, was strictly prohibited for ordinary citizens. Anyone caught wearing it faced severe penalties, sometimes even death.
The famous Vestal virgins had their own dress codes, and even the plebeians had limits on decorative attire, creating a society where fashion was inseparable from legality. Even food and drink were subject to legal oversight. Laws restricted extravagant banquets, controlled wine distribution, and forbade lavish spending that could threaten social stability. Citizens could be fined for serving forbidden foods or exceeding approved quantities at meals. Imagine hosting a dinner and being arrested because your guests were served too much exotic cheese or rare fish. Roman lawmakers clearly believed that overindulgence threatened the moral fiber of the state. And yet, for all the rigidity, Romans were inventive in circumventing these laws. A senator's wife might weave tiny gold threads into her hair, bypassing jewelry limits. Merchants found clever ways to advertise product without violating sumptuary restrictions. Citizens could dress in layers to appear compliant while subtly flaunting forbidden colors underneath. Law was omnipresent, but human creativity always found a way to test its limits. Finally, there were punishments so bizarre they seem almost comical. Citizens could be fined or shamed for feeding pets in public in ways deemed inappropriate, laughing during ceremonies or while others mourned, owning more than a legally permitted amount of personal items like gold or furniture, speaking out of turn in the Senate or public gatherings. In Rome, every ordinary rhythm of life, from waking to sleeping, eating to dressing, laughing to grieving, was all regulated by law. The effect was a society simultaneously orderly, suffocating, and endlessly fascinating. Romans believed that only through such strict control could their civilization flourish, yet the result was a world full of stories that seem stranger than fiction to modern eyes. Every law, no matter how minor or absurd, told a story of a civilization obsessed with hierarchy, morality, and civic order. And every Roman citizen who navigated these rules, sometimes cleverly, sometimes disastrously, became part of a living drama caught between personal desire and the omnipresent gaze of the law.
The grandeur of Rome, the soaring arches, the marble temples, the teeming forums, belied a legal system that could turn everyday life into a high-stakes game. Behind every law, there were stories of ordinary citizens pushed to their limits, clever rebels, and tragic victims of the state's obsession with control. These were not abstract statutes. They were living rules, tested daily by the ingenuity and folly of Romans themselves. Consider the case of Gaius Fannius, a merchant in the late Republic. He was fined repeatedly under sumptuary laws for wearing forbidden purple threads in his tunic, claiming they were a religious symbol rather than a fashion choice. The city court debated the case for months, ultimately ruling that the threads were indeed a violation, but allowed him to keep the garment by publicly declaring his devotion to the gods. It was a subtle victory. Fannius had technically broken the law, but avoided severe punishment through clever reasoning. Then there was the famous scandal involving Livia Drusilla, wife of Emperor Augustus. Livia, already a powerful figure, was bound by the Lex Poppaea Poppaea and other sumptuary restrictions, limiting her display of wealth. Yet she often flaunted these rules, using layered garments, intricate hairstyles, and subtle jewelry to assert status without triggering legal consequences. Livia's ingenuity demonstrates how the elite navigated Roman laws to maintain power while avoiding prosecution, an art form as sophisticated as any political maneuver in the Senate. One of the most shocking laws concerned funerals. During the reign of Emperor Claudius, a wealthy citizen, Publius Claudius Pulcher, attempted to construct an elaborate tomb exceeding legal size limits. Neighbors filed complaints, claiming it violated sumptuary regulations. The court ruled against him, and the tomb was partially dismantled, leaving Pulcher publicly shamed. In a society obsessed with honor and public image, this punishment was more humiliating than any fine. To modernize, the idea that a law could dictate the exact dimensions of a tomb
seems almost comical, but in Rome, it was a serious civic offense. Criminal cases also reveal the extremes of Roman law. A young man, Marcus Aemilius, was prosecuted for laughing loudly during a public funeral, violating laws governing decorum. Witnesses testified that his laughter had disrupted the sacred rites and offended the spirits of the deceased. Marcus was fined and required to publicly apologize, an event that left him socially ostracized. The absurdity of being punished for laughter highlights the Romans' obsession with ritual and public conduct. Even children were not exempt from legal scrutiny. Under patria potestas, a father could legally punish his son for misbehavior, but there are documented cases of Roman courts intervening when punishments were considered excessively harsh. One notable case involved a young boy accused of minor theft. His father intended to sell him into slavery. The court ultimately ruled against the father, citing public interest and the boy's potential contribution to society. This demonstrates that, despite the severity of Roman law, practical considerations and social reputation could temper its application. Religion and superstition also grounded legal battles. A seer, claiming to predict the future, was brought to trial for making a false prophecy that allegedly caused public panic. The court considered both the veracity of the prophecy and its social impact, ultimately exiling the seer for disrupting civic order. Romans treated prophecy not merely as belief, but as a matter of law. Words could be as dangerous as deeds. Even seemingly mundane acts like feeding pets could become legal entanglements. A wealthy woman, Cornelia, was fined for feeding her dogs in a public plaza, a violation of municipal regulations aimed at maintaining public order. Cornelia argued that the dogs were part of her household and that feeding them publicly was harmless. The magistrates were unconvinced, issuing a small but humiliating fine. The incident became fodder for gossip, demonstrating how laws extended into private life in ways modern citizens would find intrusive. These cases, bizarre as they seem, were part of a larger system designed to maintain hierarchy, ritual, and civic order. Sumptuary laws reinforced social divisions. Funeral regulations maintained respect for tradition. Restrictions on speech, prophecy, and public behavior preserved authority. For citizens, navigating this labyrinth of regulations required cleverness, subtlety, and sometimes sheer luck. Every violation carried not just legal risk, but social consequence, and every loophole could be exploited by the cunning. Rome, then, was not just a city of marble and empire. It was a living legal organism, stretching into every aspect of life. Citizens were actors on a stage dictated by law, performing rituals, wearing prescribed colors, and regulating behavior not just for themselves, but for the approval of gods, neighbors, and magistrates. And amidst this, the stories of those who pushed boundaries, intentionally or accidentally, provide a window into a society as fascinating as it was strange.
The Roman Empire was not just a political and military powerhouse. It was a society meticulously woven together by law. Every street, every home, every banquet, and every funeral was touched by statutes that shaped behavior, hierarchy, and public perception. Over time, these laws became more than just rules. They were instruments of culture, morality, and political control. Consider the role of sumptuary laws, which dictated what colors could be worn, what jewelry was permitted, and even how extravagant a meal could be. While they often appear absurd to modern eyes, they had a profound effect on Roman society. By legally controlling display, these laws reinforced the social hierarchy. The elite flaunted wealth within legal boundaries, the middle class learned restraint, and the lower classes were visibly distinguished. Fashion, in effect, became a language of legality. Citizens learned quickly that every choice, every toga, every ring, every hairstyle carried social and legal weight.
Politically, these laws were equally potent. The Lex Papia Papea, encouraging marriage and procreation, was part of Augustus's broader campaign to strengthen the moral fiber of Rome and stabilize society. By incentivizing marriage and punishing celibacy, the state attempted to regulate private life for the public good. Laws governing speech, satire, and prophecy reinforced authority. Criticism of magistrates or the emperor could be dangerous, ensuring that the ruling class maintained control over both public opinion and civic rituals. Funeral laws, which dictated proper mourning behavior and tomb construction, had a dual purpose. They preserved religious tradition, ensuring that the spirits of the dead were respected, and they reinforced social stratification. Tombs were more than memorials. They were status symbols, visible reminders of family prestige. Breaking these laws, intentionally or through ignorance, could lead to humiliation and social ostracism, showing that Rome's legal system was as concerned with reputation as it was with obedience. The cultural consequences of these laws were profound. Romans learned to navigate a complex web of regulations creatively, developing subtlety, negotiation skills, and a keen awareness of social optics. Clever citizens like Gaius Fannius or Livia Drusilla became masters of legal interpretation, bending rules without breaking them outright. These adaptations were part of what made Roman society resilient, capable of maintaining order while accommodating human ambition and ingenuity. Even religion was influenced. Mandatory participation in ceremonies and strict adherence to ritual laws reinforced a collective civic identity. Public festivals, sacrifices, and processions were governed by statute, intertwining legal obedience with religious observance. A citizen's devotion, or lack thereof, was not just spiritual, but also a measure of legal compliance. The state ensured that the gods were honored correctly, and failure to comply could provoke legal repercussions, demonstrating the tight fusion of law, morality, and piety. The legacy of these laws stretches far beyond ancient Rome. Many modern legal concepts, from property rights to family law, trace their roots to Roman statutes. Even today, elements of etiquette, dress codes, and civic decorum echo the Roman obsession with order and propriety. The idea that laws can regulate private behavior, shape morality, or enforce social hierarchy is not new. It was codified and perfected in Rome. Yet the stories of ordinary Romans navigating these bizarre rules remain the most compelling legacy. From merchants subtly flaunting forbidden colors, to widows honoring tomb restrictions with ingenuity, to citizens fined for laughing at the wrong time, we see a society where law was omnipresent, but human spirit found ways to assert itself. These anecdotes remind us that legal systems are not just instruments of control, they are also frameworks for human ingenuity, creativity, and occasionally rebellion. Rome's weird laws, while shocking, serve as a mirror reflecting both the society that created them and the timeless human impulses that test, bend, and sometimes break them. They teach us that civilization, no matter how sophisticated, is always a delicate balance between regulation and freedom, between order and chaos, and between the absurd and the necessary. By the time the sun rose over the Colosseum, Rome's citizens were already immersed in a world where law dictated almost every motion, every word, every gesture. And yet, some of the laws enforced in the empire were so extreme, so utterly bizarre, that even Romans themselves found ways to push against them or pay the price for ignoring them. Consider the case of Publius Cornelius, a man accused of violating multiple sumptuary laws at once. He had dared to wear purple-threaded sandals while hosting a lavish banquet featuring exotic foods. Under Roman statutes, both offenses were punishable. One threatened social order, the other moral decency. Cornelius was fined heavily, and the event was recorded in public records as a cautionary tale. dress in forbidden colors, and overindulge at your own peril. For modern audiences, this sounds absurd, but in Rome, it was a potent combination of law and social enforcement. Some laws went beyond mere fines. The Lex Julia Divi prohibited acts of violence, but extended to bizarre forms of personal behavior. A man caught mocking another citizen in public could be dragged before a magistrate and whipped, while women caught in public quarrels or disputes could face banishment or public humiliation. Even private insults, if witnessed in the wrong place, could escalate into legal action. The streets of Rome were not just physical spaces, they were legal zones patrolled by the omnipresent authority of law. Perhaps the strangest laws affected daily gestures. Citizens could be punished for laughing at the wrong time, crying too loudly, or gesturing in a manner deemed disrespectful. One famous case involved a young woman who laughed during a religious procession in honor of the goddess Ceres. Witnesses claimed she had disrespected the sacred rites. The magistrates fined her and forced her to apologize publicly in the forum, a punishment that humiliated her and reminded all observers that even private emotions were subject to public regulation. Then there were laws about pets and animals. Romans were meticulous about public order, and feeding your dog or cat in unauthorized areas could lead to fines. Some wealthy citizens even faced temporary confiscation of pets if authorities deemed their behavior disruptive. In one record, a man's parrot was seized for repeating insulting words in the marketplace, demonstrating that animals, too, could be entangled in legal disputes. Criminal law could be brutal. Under certain statutes, adultery or sexual misconduct was punished with exile or death, depending on the victim's social class and the offender's status. A freed woman caught committing adultery with a senator's son could face execution, while a man of equivalent rank might escape with only a fine. Romans codified morality into law in a way that seems almost unimaginable today, blending social hierarchy, gender norms, and legal authority. Even seemingly harmless public actions could be risky. Carrying objects in public that violated weight, size, or usage regulations, such as oversized baskets, heavy carts, or certain types of ceremonial items, could result in legal trouble. Merchants had to calculate every detail of transport and display, or face fines and confiscation. The law was omnipresent, dictating even the minutiae of commerce and public logistics. Perhaps the most infamous cases involved ritual and superstition. A citizen claiming to summon spirits or predict the future could face exile or execution. The Romans, deeply religious and wary of divine wrath, treated superstition as a legal matter. Words and deeds had consequences, not just socially, but cosmically. One documented case involved a man exiled for performing a suspicious ritual on the Capitoline Hill, allegedly endangering the city's safety through improper rites. Through all of these extreme laws, a clear pattern emerges. Roman law was not just about crime and punishment, but about maintaining order, hierarchy, and morality. Every regulation, no matter how strange, was intended to enforce conformity, protect social order, or preserve religious and civic tradition. And yet, as always, citizens found ways to navigate, bend, or exploit the system. Clever merchants, clever women, and cunning politicians all discovered loopholes, ensuring that the human spirit remained as flexible as the law was rigid. Rome, in essence, was a civilization where law and life were inseparable. A citizen could not step onto a street, host a banquet, or mourn a loved one without interacting with statutes that defined behavior, morality, and decorum. And it is these stories, the fines, the humiliations, the clever evasions, and the shocking punishments that make Roman law both terrifying and fascinating, a testament to a society where the absurd and the necessary coexisted under the gaze of the state.
As dawn broke over the Roman Forum,
The city was already alive with the sounds of commerce, conversation, and the footsteps of citizens navigating a labyrinth of laws that governed nearly every aspect of life. In Rome, law was more than a guide to behavior. It was a force shaping society, controlling morality, and influencing daily life in ways both practical and astonishing. Among the most notorious were the sumptuary laws, designed to control wealth display and maintain social hierarchy. Citizens could be punished for wearing garments of forbidden colors, owning more than a certain quantity of gold, or hosting dinners deemed too extravagant. These laws were intended to prevent envy, reinforce class distinctions, and curb moral decay. But they also created endless opportunities for clever evasion. Take, for example, the case of Aemilia Scaura, a wealthy matron known for her cunning. The law limited the amount of gold she could wear in public, yet she found ways to adorn herself subtly, weaving thin gold threads into her hairstyle so they were technically permissible. Citizens whispered about her ingenuity, but she never faced legal reprisal. Her story illustrates a recurring theme in Rome. The law was strict, but human creativity often found loopholes. Punishments for breaking sumptuary laws could be surprisingly harsh. One senator, Gaius Sextius, was fined for wearing purple stripes in a toga while attending a festival. The offense seemed minor, yet the public humiliation was severe. He was required to appear in the forum, dressed plainly, and publicly apologize for his extravagance. Such punishments reinforced the message that obedience to law was inseparable from social reputation. Family life was equally entangled with legal oversight. Fathers wielded patria potestas, granting them extraordinary authority over children, yet this power was tempered by law and social expectation. One recorded case involved a father attempting to disinherit his son for a minor social faux pas. The court intervened, arguing that the punishment was disproportionate and that the son's potential contribution to society warranted leniency. In Rome, law and family intersected in ways that could elevate, protect, or punish, often depending on the public eye. Even seemingly trivial behavior could result in legal consequences. Citizens were fined for laughing too loudly at public funerals, crying inappropriately during ceremonies, or gesturing disrespectfully toward magistrates. These laws revealed the Romans' obsession with decorum and ritual. Emotions, gestures, and conduct were all subject to legal scrutiny. One woman, caught laughing during a festival honoring Ceres, was forced to make a public apology in the forum, her humiliation serving as a cautionary example to all citizens. Animals, too, were bound by legal regulation. A wealthy Roman woman, Cornelia, was fined for feeding her dogs in a public space, a violation of municipal ordinances. Another citizen had a parrot confiscated for repeating offensive phrases in the marketplace, demonstrating that the Romans took public order seriously, even when it came to pets. These seemingly absurd regulations reinforced the principle that citizens and their possessions were always accountable to the state. Religion remained deeply intertwined with law. Rituals, sacrifices, and festivals were not simply cultural events, they were legally mandated observances. Failure to participate correctly could result in fines, exile, or public censure. A citizen performing a ritual incorrectly risked incurring the wrath of the gods and violating civic law simultaneously. One notable case involved a man exiled for performing unauthorized rites on the Capitoline Hill, allegedly endangering Rome itself. And yet, despite the rigor and absurdity of these laws, life in Rome thrived. Citizens navigated restrictions creatively, bending the rules without breaking them outright. Merchants used clever marketing to skirt regulations. Women found subtle ways to display wealth, and ordinary citizens learned to interpret the law with nuance and cunning. The interplay between law and human ingenuity created a society both structured and dynamic, where obedience and cleverness coexisted in daily life. Rome's weird laws, in short, were more than curiosities. They were instruments shaping culture, morality, and social identity. They dictated behavior, reinforced hierarchy, and ensured civic order. Yet they also inspired ingenuity, resistance, and storytelling, leaving a legacy that continues to fascinate historians and modern audiences alike.
As the sun climbed high over the rooftops of Rome, the city teemed with life, its citizens moving through streets, forums, and baths, while navigating a legal system that controlled nearly every action. From the grandest senator to the humblest plebeian, no one was entirely free from the scrutiny of law. And some of the rules, by modern standards, were so bizarre that they seem more like fiction than reality. Take, for instance, the laws regulating personal appearance. It was illegal for anyone outside the imperial family to wear certain colors, especially purple, which was reserved exclusively for the emperor. Violators faced severe fines, public shaming, or even exile. Yet Romans found ingenious ways to skirt the rules. Women like Aemilia Scaura wove thin gold threads into their hair to appear lavishly adorned without technically breaking the law, while men carefully layered tunics to hide forbidden colors underneath. Even in matters of fashion, the law demanded vigilance and creativity. Food and drink were also heavily regulated. The Lex Fania restricted extravagant banquets, limiting the types of food and the number of dishes served. Citizens who dared host lavish feasts could be fined or publicly humiliated. One notorious case involved a merchant who served imported fish and exotic fruits at a private dinner, only to be summoned before the magistrates and forced to pay a large fine and publicly apologize for his excess. Even culinary indulgence could be a criminal offense in Rome. Public behavior was equally constrained. Citizens could be punished for laughing at funerals, speaking out of turn in the Senate, or gesturing disrespectfully toward magistrates. One young man, Marcus Aemilius, laughed during a solemn funeral, and witnesses testified that his behavior disrupted sacred rites and offended the spirits of the dead. He was fined and required to apologize publicly in the forum, his humiliation serving as a warning to all. In Rome, emotion and expression were not private, they were civic responsibilities, enforceable by law. Pets and animals, surprisingly, were not exempt from regulation. Feeding your dog in a public space could earn a fine, while a parrot repeating offensive phrases in the marketplace could be confiscated. One wealthy woman, Cornelia, had her small dogs seized for public nuisance, though she argued they were harmless. The magistrates remained unconvinced, demonstrating that even animals could become entangled in legal disputes in Rome. Religion and superstition further complicated daily life. Laws mandated participation in ceremonies, festivals, and sacrifices, with strict rules governing behavior. Improper ritual or failure to observe sacred rites could result in fines, exile, or social disgrace. A man performing unauthorized rites on the Capitoline Hill was exiled, accused of endangering the city's safety through improper worship. In Rome, disobedience to divine law was inseparable from civic disobedience. Bizarrely, even children and families were under legal scrutiny. Fathers wielded patria potestas, holding extraordinary authority over their children, including the power to punish, disinherit, or even execute them. Yet courts sometimes intervened when punishments were deemed excessive. In one case, a father sought to sell his son into slavery for a minor transgression. The court ruled against him, citing the boy's potential contribution to society. These regulations show that while the law granted power, it also demanded judgment and moderation. And then there were the most extreme and curious statutes, laws governing private conduct,
personal belongings and civic rituals. A citizen could be fined for storing too many possessions, feeding pets incorrectly, or displaying wealth beyond prescribed limits. Even minor acts like spitting in public, laughing at the wrong time, or wearing unauthorized clothing could escalate into legal trouble. The Roman state ensured that every citizen, object, and action was accountable, creating a society in which law permeated every aspect of life. Yet, amidst the absurdity, there was room for ingenuity. Citizens learned to interpret, bend, and exploit the law. Merchants advertised cleverly, women dressed subtly, and families navigated regulations with cunning. Law, no matter how strict or bizarre, became a framework for human creativity, negotiation, and survival. The stories of those who skirted, challenged, or suffered under Roman law reveal a civilization both orderly and flexible, rigid yet astonishingly adaptable. Rome, in essence, was a city where law and life were inseparable. Every act, gesture, and choice could carry legal, social, or moral consequences. And it is this interplay, the tension between strict regulation and human ingenuity, that makes Roman law so endlessly fascinating, even centuries later.
Rome was a city of spectacle, power, and law, a place where public display and private behavior were inseparably tied to civic regulation. Some of the most extraordinary stories in Roman history come not from battles or politics, but from the absurdity of its laws and the punishments that accompanied their violation. One of the most famous and bizarre cases involved Marcus Licinius Crassus, not the wealthy triumvir, but a namesake citizen punished for breaking sumptuary regulations at a public festival. Crassus wore a tunic with unauthorized embroidery and hosted a feast with more than the allowed number of exotic dishes. Magistrates fined him heavily and ordered him to stand in the forum wearing a plain toga, publicly confessing his violation. The humiliation alone, they believed, would reinforce civic order. To modernize, being fined for festive luxury seems trivial, but in Rome, it was a potent lesson in obedience and decorum. Funeral laws also led to extreme and tragic outcomes. One woman, Claudia Pulchra, was accused of crying excessively at her husband's funeral, violating laws meant to maintain ritual propriety. Witnesses described her mourning as disruptive and inappropriate. She was fined, required to publicly apologize, and ostracized by her social circle. In Roman society, grief was not merely personal, it was a legal performance, a social duty enforced by statute. Even laughter could be criminal. A young man attending a religious procession reportedly laughed at a solemn ceremony and was brought before a magistrate. The law mandated punishment for disrupting sacred rites, and he was fined and forced to apologize in the forum. The absurdity of being punished for an uncontrollable human emotion highlights the extraordinary power of Roman law over personal conduct. Some punishments combined humiliation with practical consequences. Citizens caught violating sumptuary or public behavior laws might face confiscation of property, fines, or public shaming, often simultaneously. One merchant, fined for displaying forbidden goods at a market, had both his items seized and his name inscribed on a public list of offenders, a record meant to shame him before all of Rome. The law functioned as both a corrective and a spectacle, reinforcing social norms through fear, ridicule, and visibility. Criminal laws could be ruthless. Adultery, theft, and false prophecy carried punishments ranging from exile to death, depending on the social class of the victim and the offender. A freedwoman caught in adultery with a senator's son could face execution, while a man of similar social standing might escape with a fine. Roman law codified morality and hierarchy in ways that appear shocking today, blending justice, control, and social hierarchy.
Even minor acts like feeding pets in public could escalate into legal conflict. Cornelia, a wealthy woman, had her dogs temporarily confiscated because magistrates considered them a public nuisance. Another citizen's parrot was seized for repeating offensive phrases in the marketplace. For the Romans, law extended not just to citizens but to their possessions, creating a city where accountability was absolute. Ritual and superstition remained deeply intertwined with the law. A man performing unauthorized rites on the Capitoline Hill was exiled for allegedly endangering Rome's safety. Religion, civic obedience, and legal authority were inseparable. Violating one often violated the others. The city treated speech, ritual, and even gesture as enforceable, binding citizens to a complex network of rules dictating morality, propriety, and public behavior. And yet, despite these extreme regulations, citizens continuously found loopholes. Merchants advertised cleverly, women dressed subtly, and families navigated regulations with ingenuity. Law was rigid, yet human creativity thrived within it. Rome became a civilization where obedience and ingenuity coexisted, where every act was both legally and socially meaningful, and where the absurd and the necessary were often indistinguishable. These stories, humiliations, fines, confiscations, and clever evasions, reveal the astonishing nature of Roman law. They show a civilization obsessed with order, hierarchy, and morality, yet brimming with ingenuity, defiance, and human drama. The laws may seem absurd today, but they shaped the very fabric of Rome, ensuring that every citizen's life was interwoven with regulation, consequence, and creativity.
In the heart of Rome, law was not just a framework for justice, it was a force that dictated every aspect of life, from the clothes a citizen wore to the way they mourned a loved one. Yet some Roman laws were so extreme, so peculiar, that even those who enforced them must have paused in disbelief. Consider the regulations on public gestures and behavior. A citizen could be fined for raising a hand in a way deemed disrespectful, for nodding too vigorously in a conversation with a magistrate, or for laughing too loudly at a festival. One documented case involved a man fined for snapping his fingers during a religious procession, a gesture considered irreverent. To modernize, such rules seem absurd, but in Rome, gestures were a legal matter, tied to social hierarchy and religious decorum. Over-celebration and ostentation were similarly restricted. Sumptuary laws limited the number of dishes at a banquet, the type of food served, and even the number of guests allowed. One wealthy citizen was fined for hosting a birthday celebration with more than 3 exotic foods, despite the feast being for close family. Such laws ensured that public displays of wealth remained controlled, reinforcing social order and preventing envy among citizens. Even laughter and amusement could be criminalized. A young Roman attending a solemn ceremony laughed at a minor mishap during the ritual. Witnesses accused him of disrupting sacred proceedings, and he was fined, required to apologize publicly, and temporarily barred from attending civic events. In Rome, amusement was not merely personal, it had legal consequences if it offended public decency. Pet ownership and behavior were equally regulated. Cornelia, a wealthy matron, had her dogs confiscated for feeding them in a public plaza, which violated municipal ordinances. Another citizen had a parrot seized for repeating phrases deemed offensive in a marketplace. Romans took public order seriously, and even minor animal behavior could lead to legal intervention. Perhaps most shocking were laws intertwining morality, hierarchy, and punishment. Adultery, theft, and sexual misconduct were punishable depending on the social class of the victim and the offender. A freedwoman committing adultery with a senator's son might face execution, while a man of equal social rank could escape with a fine.
In these laws, morality and hierarchy were inseparable from legality, shaping both behavior and social perception. Even private possessions were controlled. Romans could be fined for hoarding too many items, displaying forbidden wealth, or exceeding limits on personal property. Merchants and citizens had to navigate these laws carefully. A single misstep could result in fines, confiscation, or public humiliation. Religion and superstition remained tightly bound to legal enforcement. Unauthorized rituals, incorrect sacrifices, or failure to participate in mandatory ceremonies could lead to exile or public shaming. A man performing improper rites on the Capitoline Hill was exiled for allegedly endangering the city, showing that in Rome, religion and law were inseparable. Despite the rigidity of these statutes, citizens continually found ways to bend, evade, or creatively interpret the rules. Merchants advertised cleverly, women displayed wealth subtly, and families found loopholes to comply while still achieving personal goals. These stories reveal a society where human ingenuity constantly met the extremes of law, creating a fascinating tension between regulation and creativity. The Romans' obsession with control extended into daily life so completely that even small gestures, emotions, and possessions could have legal consequences. Laughter, grief, fashion, food, and pets were all under scrutiny. And yet, life went on. Citizens adapted, resisted, and navigated a complex web of statutes with skill, cleverness, and sometimes audacity. Ultimately, these stories of extreme, strange, and sometimes absurd laws illustrate the remarkable complexity of Roman society. They show a civilization where law governed morality, ritual, and hierarchy, but where human creativity, cunning, and resilience ensured that life remained vibrant, dynamic, and endlessly fascinating. Rome's weird laws were more than rules. They were instruments of social engineering, moral guidance, and civic control, leaving a legacy that still captivates historians, writers, and curious minds today. As the sun set over the Forum, casting long shadows across marble columns and bustling streets, it became clear that Rome was not merely a city of grandeur and power, it was a city of law. But unlike modern legal systems where statutes are often abstract and impersonal, Roman law was intensely intimate, touching every aspect of life, from birth to death, from laughter to grief, from clothing to conversation. The stories we've explored, from citizens fined for laughter to matronly ingenuity in circumventing sumptuary laws, to extreme punishments for improper ritual, reveal a civilization obsessed with order, hierarchy, and moral conduct. Every law served multiple purposes: to reinforce social norms, to maintain civic order, to uphold religious observance, and to codify morality. At the same time, these regulations created opportunities for human creativity and cunning. Citizens found loopholes in sumptuary restrictions, merchants cleverly navigated trade regulations, and families negotiated the boundaries of parental authority. Life in Rome was a constant negotiation between rigid statutes and human ingenuity, where law and daily existence were inseparable. Culturally, these laws left a profound imprint. Sumptuary restrictions dictated fashion and display, funeral laws shaped mourning rituals, and civic regulations influenced commerce and public conduct. Roman society was defined as much by what it forbade as by what it permitted, creating a framework in which order and hierarchy were legally enforced at every level of life. Politically, these statutes served to protect the elite, reinforce social hierarchy, and preserve state authority. By regulating behavior, wealth, and even morality, the law functioned as a tool of governance. Magistrates, senators, and emperors could ensure that society conformed to ideals of propriety, piety, and civic duty, while simultaneously providing avenues for cunning citizens to navigate the system without outright rebellion. And yet, despite the strictness and sometimes absurdity of Roman law, one theme emerges repeatedly. Human life found ways to persist, adapt, and even flourish within constraint. Whether through clever circumvention, subtle negotiation, or bold defiance, Romans continually tested the boundaries of legality, revealing both the resilience of the human spirit and the flexibility of a civilization built on law. These stories of bizarre punishments, peculiar restrictions, and extreme oversight are more than curiosities. They offer a window into the values, priorities, and anxieties of Roman society. They show us a world where every citizen was accountable, where morality and legality were intertwined, and where even the smallest act could carry social, religious, or legal weight. Rome's weird laws, shocking and sometimes absurd as they were, shaped the daily rhythms of life, influenced cultural norms, and left a lasting legacy. Modern law, etiquette, and civic regulation owe a debt to these ancient statutes, and the stories of those who lived under them continue to fascinate, entertain, and enlighten.
As the echoes of Rome's bustling streets fade into history, the strange and astonishing laws of the empire leave a legacy that extends far beyond the forum, the baths, and the colonnaded streets. At first glance, these statutes, laws governing laughter, mourning, clothing, pets, and even gestures, might seem like odd curiosities, relics of a civilization obsessed with control. But beneath the surface lies a civilization that understood something fundamental about society, behavior, and human psychology. One key lesson is that laws reflect the values and anxieties of a society. In Rome, sumptuary regulations, funeral rules, and restrictions on speech and prophecy were not arbitrary. They were designed to preserve hierarchy, enforce morality, and maintain public order. By studying these laws, we gain insight into what Romans feared, what they revered, and what they believed could unravel society if left unchecked. Purple threads, overindulgent banquets, and loud laughter were more than annoyances. They were symbols of potential disorder in a civilization obsessed with precision, ritual, and hierarchy. Another striking lesson is the interplay between law and human ingenuity. Despite the strictness of Roman statutes, citizens constantly found ways to adapt, circumvent, or subtly subvert the rules. Women like Aemilia Scaura navigated sumptuary restrictions through hairstyle tricks. Merchants skirted trade and banquet regulations with clever interpretation. Families negotiated parental authority and mourning rituals with ingenuity. Roman law may have been rigid, but human creativity thrived within its constraints. In a way, these stories mirror our own modern experience. Laws exist to guide behavior, but human cleverness often finds ways to navigate or reinterpret them. Roman law also illustrates the power of legal systems to shape social behavior. Laws on appearance, wealth, ritual, and public conduct were instruments of social engineering. By codifying morality and etiquette into law, the Romans ensured that behavior aligned with societal ideals, and violations were met with public censure, fines, or humiliation. Modern societies still do this. Think dress codes, etiquette expectations, or regulations on public spaces. But Rome pushed this principle to its extreme, creating a civilization where even private actions were public concerns. These ancient laws also highlight the intersection of law, morality, and religion. For Romans, civic obedience, ritual correctness, and moral propriety were inseparable. Failure to mourn properly, perform rituals correctly, or honor social hierarchy could invoke legal, social, and spiritual consequences simultaneously. This integration of law with cultural and religious norms ensured that statutes were not mere rules. They were instruments for shaping identity,
behavior, and belief. Finally, the bizarre, sometimes absurd nature of these laws reminds us that human societies have always struggled to balance freedom with order. Rome's extreme regulations on laughter, clothing, pets, and funerals might shock us today, but they reflect timeless challenges: how to maintain social cohesion, how to preserve morality, and how to enforce rules fairly. And just as in Rome, modern societies continue to grapple with these tensions, albeit in less dramatic ways. The stories of citizens fined for purple sandals, parrot misbehavior, excessive grief, or public laughter are not just historical oddities. They are windows into the daily lives, struggles, and creativity of Romans. They remind us that law is not only about punishment, but also about negotiation, adaptation, and the human impulse to navigate complex rules. In this sense, the weird laws of ancient Rome continue to resonate. They reveal the eternal dance between society, authority, and individual ingenuity.
As we step back from the marble streets and crowded forums of ancient Rome, it becomes clear that the strange and sometimes absurd laws we've explored were more than curiosities. They were the foundation of a legal tradition that still shapes the modern world. The Romans codified principles that have echoed for centuries, even as the specific rules, laws against laughing too loudly, wearing forbidden colors, or feeding pets in public, may seem unbelievable today. At the heart of Roman legal philosophy was a focus on order, hierarchy, and predictability. Laws regulated not just crime, but private behavior, morality, and civic duty. Modern legal systems inherited this emphasis. Today, we see remnants in property law, family law, contracts, and public conduct regulations. The Roman concepts of patria potestas, civic responsibility, and legal penalties for moral transgressions influenced European civil law traditions and eventually legal thinking worldwide. For example, Roman property law, with its detailed regulations on land use, inheritance, and public versus private space, laid the groundwork for concepts still used in modern legal systems. The Romans' obsession with sumptuary restrictions may seem trivial, but it reflects a core principle. Laws can regulate social behavior to maintain order, a principle echoed today in zoning laws, public safety regulations, and even professional codes of conduct. Roman criminal law, with its mixture of fines, public humiliation, and corporal punishment, also influenced the development of modern legal thought. The idea that punishment should fit the social status of the offender or the severity of the transgression can be seen as an early form of proportional justice, a concept central to contemporary legal systems. And the Romans' integration of moral and civic obligations into law foreshadow modern legislation concerning ethics, civic duty, and public behavior. Yet, the most fascinating aspect of Roman law, and what continues to capture the imagination, is the absurd and extreme nature of some statutes. Citizens could be punished for trivial gestures, emotional displays, or minor indulgences. A parrot's words, a matron's hairstyle, or a young man's laughter could all trigger legal consequences. These laws remind us that legal systems are deeply human creations, reflecting not just rationality and logic, but also fear, superstition, social pressure, and moral anxiety. Modern audiences are captivated by these stories because they highlight the extremes of control in a human society, the tension between law and daily life, and the ingenuity required to navigate restrictive rules. We see echoes of Rome in our own lives, rules governing clothing, conduct, speech, or public spaces, and we can appreciate how clever individuals have always found ways to bend or challenge the law. The Romans teach us that law is never just about enforcement, it is about culture, morality, and identity. It shapes who we are, how we interact, and what society values. And, in the case of Rome,
it also gives us stories that are simultaneously shocking, hilarious, and deeply human. Citizens fined for purple sandals, parrot misbehavior, or excessive grief remind us that the line between order and absurdity has always been narrow, and that human creativity is ever present in the face of regulation.
By the late afternoon, as the sun cast its golden glow across the marble streets of Rome, it became increasingly clear to anyone walking the city that law was everywhere. But not just the law of justice or governance, the law of absurdity, the law of social etiquette, the law of morality codified into statutes so strange that even centuries later, historians struggle to believe they were enforced. Romans, obsessed with order, hierarchy, and morality, created laws that regulated nearly every aspect of life. Some of these were logical, if strict. Rules about property, taxes, trade, or military service made sense in the context of a sprawling empire. Others, however, fell into the realm of the bizarre, the comic, or the outright shocking. These laws reveal not only Roman priorities, but also their anxieties, their humor, and their belief that even the smallest act could ripple through society, with consequences far greater than expected. Take, for instance, the laws governing laughter. Romans believed that inappropriate laughter, especially during public or sacred occasions, was a threat to decorum and civic morality. One documented case involved a young man attending a funeral of a respected magistrate. While the ceremony was solemn, the man could not suppress a laugh when a servant tripped, spilling water on the ceremonial altar. Witnesses immediately reported him. The magistrate summoned him, fined him, and required a public apology in the forum. Modern readers might chuckle at the absurdity, imagining a man fined for a natural human reaction, yet to the Romans, decorum was inseparable from law. Laughter had the potential to disrupt sacred rituals and civic order, and as such, it fell under legal scrutiny. Similarly, grief was regulated with legal precision. Mourning too loudly, too long, or too extravagantly could result in fines. Women, in particular, had to navigate these laws carefully, as displays of grief could either be perceived as excessive or insufficient, each carrying consequences. Claudia Pulchra, a wealthy matron, reportedly faced censure for her tearful, dramatic mourning at her husband's funeral. Magistrates deemed her conduct disruptive to public order, and she was forced to apologize publicly. In Rome, grief was not merely an emotion, it was a performance, a legal obligation, and a measure of social decorum. Roman laws also ventured into fashion with remarkable specificity. Purple, the color of emperors, was strictly forbidden for ordinary citizens, yet citizens found ways to circumvent the law. Women would weave thin purple threads into hairstyles or stitch subtle purple designs into undergarments. Merchants crafted layered tunics to conceal forbidden colors beneath approved outer layers. Violators could face fines, public humiliation, or even harsher penalties if perceived as flaunting status unlawfully. These laws served to protect social hierarchy, ensuring that rank and privilege were visible and respected in every corner of the city. Food laws were equally strange. The lex faunia, aimed at restricting extravagance, limited both the type and quantity of dishes in public and private banquets. One wealthy Roman, attempting to host a celebratory feast for his daughter, was fined for serving imported fish alongside rare fruits. Magistrates deemed the event a violation of sumptuary laws, emphasizing that overindulgence threatened both morality and social order. Even the quantity of wine mattered. Romans tracked how much could be served, creating regulations that modern hosts might find laughably meticulous.
Yet these laws reflected the Roman belief that indulgence, if unchecked, could destabilize both family and society. Animals, too, fell under Roman legal scrutiny in ways almost unimaginable today. Citizens could be punished for feeding pets in public spaces, and one woman, Cornelia, famously had her dogs confiscated because authorities deemed their presence a nuisance. In another case, a parrot was seized for repeating words considered offensive or inappropriate in a marketplace. To the Romans, public order extended to the behavior of animals, emphasizing the totality of legal oversight. Every citizen, and even their possessions, were accountable to the law. Religion intertwined with law in even stranger ways. Unauthorized rituals, improper sacrifices, or failure to participate in civic ceremonies could result in exile or public shaming. A man performing unauthorized rites on the Capitoline Hill was exiled, accused of endangering the city's safety through impiety. Even gestures during these rituals were regulated. Citizens could face fines for clapping, nodding, or gesturing incorrectly during sacred processions. Religion, law, and civic duty were inseparable. Failure in one domain often carried consequences in all three. Perhaps most absurdly, minor personal gestures or habits could become legal offenses. Citizens could be fined for snapping fingers in public as a sign of disrespect, carrying items improperly in marketplaces or public roads, excessive decoration of tombs beyond what sumptuary laws allowed, over-celebration of birthdays or weddings that exceeded limits on luxury, minor speech offenses, even joking about magistrates or minor public officials, could result in fines or censure. In one particularly strange case, a Roman man was fined for wearing a pair of sandals with excessive purple threads while shopping in the Forum. The offense seems trivial, yet it violated the codified limits on who could display imperial colors. The fine was not merely monetary. The man was required to stand publicly in plain clothing and declare his wrongdoing, reinforcing the social lesson that status and law were intertwined. Even minor acts of kindness or domestic behavior could trigger fines. Feeding pets, distributing small amounts of food publicly, or even small gestures of charity could result in legal scrutiny if perceived to disrupt civic order. This demonstrates the ubiquity of law in Roman life. There was almost no private action entirely free from regulation. Every choice, gesture, or possession could carry consequences if misinterpreted under the law. Yet for all this absurdity, Roman citizens were far from powerless. They developed ingenuity, subtlety, and creativity to navigate the legal labyrinth. Merchants advertised cleverly, citizens layered clothing to appear compliant while flaunting subtle extravagance, and families negotiated funerary practices to remain within legal boundaries while honoring personal wishes. Life in Rome, therefore, was a constant negotiation between rigid legal expectations and human ingenuity, a dance between obedience, morality, and creativity. The humor and absurdity of these laws resonate today. Modern readers often laugh at the idea of being fined for a parrot's words, a loud laugh, or purple sandals. Yet these stories provide profound insight into Roman society, a civilization deeply invested in order, hierarchy, and social morality, yet constantly challenged by the human spirit's need for freedom, expression, and cleverness. They remind us that the extremes of law often reveal the values, anxieties, and priorities of a society in ways ordinary statutes cannot. These bizarre cases, laughter punished by fines, pets confiscated for minor offenses, over-mourning criminalized, and fashion tightly regulated, illustrate the intersection of power, social order, and personal conduct in Rome. Citizens were compelled to live under the omnipresent gaze of both the state and society, where every act was legally, socially, and morally scrutinized. Yet these same citizens continually found ways to bend the rules, showing that even in the most absurdly regulated societies, human creativity and ingenuity endure. Ultimately, the weirdest laws of ancient Rome are more than historical curiosities. They are windows into a civilization that merged morality, law, religion, and social hierarchy into a single system, controlling behavior at every level. They are also stories of human resilience, of cleverness in the face of absurdity, and of the eternal tension between regulation and freedom. Rome's bizarre legal system continues to fascinate because it is both alien and familiar, extreme yet deeply human, and, above all, a reminder that law is not merely about rules, it is about society, identity, and the endlessly inventive ways humans respond to constraints. In studying these cases, we see Rome not just as an empire of marble and conquest, but as a society of people navigating the strangest, most exacting rules imaginable. Rules that could punish a laugh, a parrot, or a thread of purple, yet rules that shaped a civilization whose influence still resonates today. The citizens who lived, laughed, grieved, and schemed under these laws remind us that law, no matter how bizarre, reveals the heart of a society, its fears, its priorities, and its
As the shadows lengthened across the Colosseum and the last merchants closed their stalls in the bustling forum, it becomes clear that Rome's laws were not merely a system of rules, they were a reflection of a civilization's values, priorities, and fears. From the extreme, absurd, and comical to the practical and morally instructive, Roman law shaped every corner of life, dictating behavior in public and private spheres alike. And in understanding these laws, we begin to see not only the Roman world, but also the timeless patterns of human society. The first lesson of Roman law is that order, hierarchy, and social cohesion were paramount. Citizens could be punished for something as seemingly trivial as wearing a thread of purple, laughing at a funeral, or feeding a pet in public. To modernize, these regulations appear ridiculous, yet they were deeply tied to maintaining social order. Clothing, behavior, and ritual were more than aesthetic or personal choices. They were signals of status, respect, and civic duty. By codifying these rules into law, the Romans ensured that each citizen understood their place in society and that social hierarchies remained visible and enforceable. Sumptuary laws, for instance, governed attire, jewelry, and public display of wealth. Purple threads or extravagant banquets could lead to fines or public shaming because overindulgence threatened the carefully balanced hierarchy that defined Roman life. A wealthy matron like Aemilia Scaura might weave subtle threads of purple into her hair or layer garments to skirt the law without breaking it outright. These regulations were more than control. They were a test of ingenuity and social awareness, a delicate game where cleverness allowed citizens to assert individuality while remaining within the bounds of the law. Food, too, was regulated with precision. The lex faunia restricted the types and quantities of dishes at banquets, emphasizing restraint and moral propriety. Citizens who overstepped boundaries, serving imported fish, exotic fruits, or multiple courses, could face fines or public humiliation. One merchant's violation led to confiscation of goods and a public apology in the forum. Even wine consumption was monitored, ensuring moderation. The Romans codified excess as a legal offense because they believed that indulgence could corrupt morals and disrupt social stability. Religion was inseparable from law, and the stakes were often severe. Performing rituals incorrectly, failing to participate in mandated ceremonies, or engaging in unauthorized rites could result in fines, exile, or public censure.
A man performing illicit rituals on the Capitoline Hill faced banishment for allegedly threatening the city through impiety. Citizens had to navigate a labyrinth of sacred obligations while remaining compliant with civil law, a delicate balance that required knowledge, attentiveness, and often creative interpretation. Animals, pets, and even minor gestures were not exempt. Cornelia's dogs were seized for public feeding, and parrots repeating offensive words could be confiscated. Citizens could be fined for snapping fingers, nodding disrespectfully, or laughing too loudly at sacred events. In Rome, the line between private and public behavior was almost non-existent. Every citizen, possession, and gesture was accountable under law, creating a society where obedience was constant and omnipresent. Yet, as we have seen, the absurdity of these laws did not render them powerless. Citizens continually found loopholes, interpreted regulations creatively, and negotiated the boundaries of compliance. Merchants marketed cleverly within trade restrictions, women displayed wealth subtly, and families navigated funerary laws to honor loved ones without breaching statutes. Life in Rome was a constant negotiation, a tension between strict regulation and human nature. Where laws are imposed, creativity and subtle rebellion inevitably follow. Another critical lesson lies in the moral and civic purpose of law. Roman statutes were not just punitive, they were formative. Laws on clothing, mourning, food, and behavior reinforced values, guided conduct, and shaped civic identity. Citizens learned decorum, social awareness, and moral propriety, not only through instruction, but through the fear of legal consequences. Laws functioned as a curriculum for life, teaching Romans what society valued and what actions were unacceptable. In this way, law and culture were inseparable, and the absurd or comical nature of some rules served a practical purpose: visibility. A citizen publicly humiliated for a minor offense became a living example of the consequences of breaking social norms. Roman law also illustrates the interconnection of morality, hierarchy, and legality. Adultery, theft, or social misconduct were punished according to both the crime and the status of those involved. A freedwoman committing adultery with a senator's son might face execution, while a man of equivalent rank could receive only a fine. Punishment reflected social hierarchy as much as the act itself. This intertwining of law and morality reinforced class distinctions while promoting compliance across all levels of society.
Perhaps most fascinating is the enduring human drama these laws produced. Citizens navigated the absurd and extreme with creativity, humor, and cleverness. The young man fined for laughter at a funeral, the matron weaving forbidden purple threads into her hair, the parrot seized for speaking rudely. Each story captures the tension between legal authority and human impulse. Rome reminds us that law is not merely a set of rules, it is a reflection of society, shaped by the fears, priorities, and ingenuity of its people. The legacy of Roman law extends far beyond the Forum. Principles of property rights, contracts, civic duty, and proportional punishment influenced European civil law and eventually global legal systems. Modern codes reflect echoes of Roman concern for social order, morality, and civic responsibility, even as the extremes of sumptuary regulation or funeral oversight have largely vanished. Studying these laws allows us to trace the evolution of legal thought and understand the origins of concepts we take for granted today. At the same time, the bizarre and absurd cases continue to captivate modern imagination. Citizens punished for a laugh, a gesture, or a thread of purple illuminate the universality of human behavior and the creativity required to navigate constraint. They also remind us that even the most organized and rational legal systems contain elements of irrationality, humor, and moral anxiety, reflecting the tension between society's ideals and human nature. Ultimately, the story of Roman law teaches us that rules are powerful, but humans are adaptable.
Law can regulate behavior, codify morality, and enforce hierarchy, but it cannot extinguish ingenuity, humor, or creativity. Romans lived under statutes that seem shocking today, yet they found ways to live full, complex lives, balancing obedience and personal expression. Their experiences reveal an enduring truth. The relationship between law and life is a delicate, dynamic, and often absurd negotiation, one that continues to shape societies across time. In reflecting on these laws, we also see that the seemingly ridiculous or extreme is not meaningless. Punishing laughter, regulating fashion, or policing pets served a broader purpose, maintaining order, teaching social values, and enforcing morality. Even in their absurdity, these rules created a coherent societal framework, demonstrating how law can structure life, influence behavior, and leave a lasting cultural imprint. As modern readers, we can marvel, laugh, and even cringe at the stories of Rome. We can imagine citizens standing in the forum, publicly apologizing for purple sandals, or merchants nervously serving permitted dishes while skirts of luxury peeked beneath their clothing. And yet, these tales carry lessons that remain relevant. Law shapes society, humans find ways to adapt, and the balance between authority and creativity is as old as civilization itself. Rome's weird laws, from the ridiculous to the shocking, remind us that human societies have always struggled to manage order, morality, and freedom simultaneously. They illuminate the interplay of hierarchy, culture, and legal authority, showing how regulation can define life down to the smallest gesture, and how citizens, in turn, navigate, bend, and sometimes challenge the system. In the end, these stories are not just about absurd rules, they are about people living under them, responding to them, and shaping society in the process. They remind us that law is not static, it is a living dialogue between authority and human behavior. And in that dialogue, the absurd, the ingenious, and the shocking all find their place, leaving a legacy that continues to fascinate, educate, and entertain more than 2 millennia later. Rome, in all its strange, rigid, and sometimes laughable legal splendor, teaches a timeless lesson. Laws reflect the society that makes them, but humans will always find ways to live, create, and resist within their framework. The weird, the shocking, and the absurd are not merely curiosities, they are the living proof of a civilization negotiating the eternal tension between control and freedom, order and chaos, authority and ingenuity.
As the Roman sun dipped low over the Tiber, casting long shadows across the city's bustling streets, it became clear that Rome was a civilization unlike any other in history, not merely because of its monuments, conquests, or political innovations, but because of the extraordinary reach of its laws. These laws were pervasive, meticulous, and sometimes so absurd that modern readers might struggle to comprehend the extent of their influence. Yet their significance is not merely in their strangeness, it lies in the profound way they shaped behavior, culture, and the very psychology of Roman citizens. Consider the streets themselves. No citizen walked freely without the tacit understanding that every gesture, word, and possession might be subject to legal scrutiny. A young man might hesitate before laughing during a festival, fearful that his mirth could be deemed disruptive. A matron might carefully weave threads of forbidden color into her attire, balancing the desire for beauty and status with the fear of public humiliation. Even a pet parrot or a small dog could provoke legal consequences if their behavior offended public norms. To the modern eye, this may seem extreme, but to Romans, law was not merely a system of justice, it was the framework of daily life, shaping interactions, social hierarchy, and moral conduct. One of the most fascinating aspects of Roman law was its integration with morality and civic duty. Rules were not merely technical, they were moral imperatives. Adultery, theft, disrespect toward officials, and improper mourning were all matters of legality intertwined with ethical and social judgment.
Punishments, whether fines, public humiliation, confiscation of goods, or exile, served not only to correct behavior, but also to reinforce societal values. When a citizen stood in the forum to apologize for wearing prohibited purple sandals, the act was simultaneously legal, social, and moral. The law taught the citizen and the observing populace how to behave in accordance with cultural ideals. These statutes also reveal the psychology of control and fear in Roman society. The omnipresence of law ensured that citizens internalized societal norms. Fear of punishment for minor transgressions, laughing inappropriately, gesturing disrespectfully, or even grieving excessively, functioned as a behavioral guide. Citizens learned to self-regulate, anticipating legal consequences even in private settings. The state, in effect, extended its influence into the private sphere, turning internal discipline into a civic responsibility. Yet, as we have seen in countless stories, human ingenuity found ways to navigate even the most restrictive laws. Citizens became masters of subtlety, creativity, and negotiation. Matrons like Emilia Scaura wove forbidden colors subtly into their attire. Merchants cleverly advertised within strict trade regulations, and families observed funerary restrictions while still honoring personal tradition. Roman law demanded obedience, but it also cultivated a culture of cunning and strategy, where understanding the letter of the law was as important as adhering to its spirit. The bizarre examples of Roman law, the fines for laughter, public humiliation for minor indulgences, or seizure of pets, highlight another essential truth. Law is inherently a reflection of society's values, fears, and priorities. Sumptuary laws reveal anxiety about social hierarchy and envy. Regulations on mourning expose concerns about civic decorum and the sanctity of public ritual. Restrictions on gestures, speech, and clothing demonstrate an obsession with symbolism, status, and order. Even laws that seem absurd today had a functional purpose in reinforcing the cohesion, hierarchy, and morality of Roman life. Moreover, Roman law demonstrates the interplay between legality and religion, a phenomenon rare in modern secular societies. Ritual correctness was not simply a spiritual matter, it was a legal one. Improper sacrifices, unauthorized rites, or failure to participate in civic religious ceremonies could result in fines, exile, or social disgrace. Romans lived in a society where the divine, the civic, and the legal were inseparable. Citizens understood that impiety was not only morally wrong, but legally punishable, and that their personal conduct could impact the well-being of the entire city. The psychological effect of these laws was profound. Romans internalized constant vigilance, self-restraint, and social awareness. Citizens became adept at reading social hierarchies, interpreting statutes, and negotiating the boundaries of acceptable behavior. Even small acts, choosing what to wear, how loudly to mourn, or whether to laugh at a festival, required calculation, creativity, and awareness of consequence. The omnipresence of law created a society where thought, behavior, and even emotion were guided by codified expectations. Despite this rigidity, the human spirit proved remarkably resilient. Stories of citizens circumventing sumptuary restrictions, negotiating funerary laws, or subtly flaunting prohibited colors demonstrate that humans are inherently inventive when faced with constraint. Roman law was both a system of control and a canvas for ingenuity, producing a culture where obedience and creativity existed in a delicate balance. These narratives remind us that regulation may limit action, but can never fully contain human expression, resourcefulness, or humor. Another striking aspect of Roman legal culture was its use of public spectacle as enforcement. Punishments were often public, fines were announced in the forum, offenders apologized before the populace, and transgressions were recorded for communal observation. This served both as deterrent and as moral instruction. Witnessing a citizen punished for trivial acts, laughing, wearing forbidden colors, or feeding pets, reinforced societal norms and taught others the boundaries of acceptable behavior. Public accountability was, in essence, a tool of governance, morality, and social cohesion. Roman law's complexity extended to the treatment of social hierarchy and class. Legal consequences were not uniform. The punishment often reflected the social status of both the offender and the victim. Adultery, theft, or insult could carry drastically different penalties depending on rank. This created a system in which citizens constantly calculated risk and strategy, weighing not only the act, but its social context. Compliance was not purely legal, it was strategic, social, and psychological. Through all this, one sees a civilization obsessed with control, yet intimately aware of human variability. Roman law sought to regulate thought, speech, behavior, and ritual, yet it also fostered cunning, ingenuity, and adaptation. Citizens lived under a system that could punish minor gestures, but also rewarded subtle skill in navigating restrictions. This duality, rigid regulation and creative negotiation, defines much of human legal experience, both ancient and modern. The legacy of Roman law extends far beyond the Forum and the Tiber. Principles of property, contracts, civic duty, proportional punishment, and social hierarchy informed European civil law and modern legal systems worldwide. Sumptuary laws and moral regulation, while extreme, reveal the underlying philosophy. Laws codify values, shape behavior, and maintain societal cohesion. The Romans' meticulous attention to detail, their intertwining of morality, religion, and legality, and their use of law as both instruction and deterrent continue to influence legal thought today. Finally, the weird, shocking, and often humorous aspects of Roman law serve as a lasting testament to the human struggle with order and freedom. Citizens fined for laughter, fashion, pets, or mourning remind us that regulation can never fully suppress ingenuity, creativity, or humor. The absurdity of some statutes provides perspective. Even the most rigid systems must contend with human unpredictability, resourcefulness, and the desire for self-expression. Roman law teaches timeless lessons. Order and chaos coexist. Authority and creativity are intertwined, and human societies constantly negotiate the boundaries of freedom and constraint. By studying these laws, we see how deeply law can shape daily life, how it interacts with culture and morality, and how even absurd statutes carried profound social significance. The Romans, in codifying both the serious and the absurd, created a legal and cultural system that fascinates, educates, and entertains millennia later. The citizens who navigated these rules, carefully measuring their gestures, words, and attire, mourning with precision, feeding pets discreetly, or finding subtle loopholes, remind us that law is never merely external. It penetrates thought, shapes behavior, and molds culture. The most bizarre and extreme Roman laws reveal the essence of civilization itself, a continuous negotiation between regulation and human nature, authority and ingenuity, order and freedom. In the end, the weird laws of ancient Rome are far more than amusing curiosities. They are a lens through which we understand society, governance, morality, and the human condition. They show that law is at once absurd and essential, restrictive and formative, punitive and instructive. And they leave a lasting legacy, the knowledge that no matter how elaborate, precise, or extreme the law may be, human creativity, resilience, and adaptability will always find a way to flourish within and sometimes despite its constraints.
If one imagines the streets of ancient Rome, it is easy to picture the grandeur, the marble columns of the Forum, the bustling marketplaces, and the imposing statues of emperors who loomed over the city with both awe and fear. But beneath the splendor of imperial architecture and civic pride ran a much more peculiar current, the intricate, often absurd legal web that touched nearly every action, thought, and possession of Roman citizens. And within this web lie the most scandalous, shocking, and laughably bizarre cases that historians have ever uncovered. Cases that illustrate not only Roman law, but also the human drama, ingenuity, and folly it produced. Take, for instance, the case of Gaius Licinius Rufus, a wealthy merchant who was fined for hosting a birthday banquet that violated the Lex Fania, the law restricting luxurious dining. On the surface, this seems mundane, but the details make it extraordinary. Rufus had served exotic fish imported from the coasts of Hispania, rare figs from Sicily, and honeyed pastries adorned with gold leaf. A guest, commenting on the extravagance, inadvertently reported the offense to the magistrates. When summoned, Rufus argued that the feast was private and small, yet magistrates reminded him that the law regulated not just the size, but the nature of luxury itself. He was forced to pay a substantial fine, publicly apologize in the forum, and swear never to indulge so lavishly again. The case highlights how Rome's obsession with moral and social regulation extended even into private celebration, punishing both excess and the perception of excess. Equally bizarre was the case of Marcus Aemilius Scaurus, a young man fined for laughing during the funeral of a senior magistrate. Witnesses reported that a slip of a servant knocking over a ceremonial vase triggered Scaurus's uncontrollable laughter. The magistrates declared that public laughter during solemn events disrupted civic virtue and offended the spirits of the dead. Scaurus was fined, required to stand publicly in the forum and deliver a formal apology. Today, this might seem like a petty or absurd penalty, but in Rome, the boundaries of emotion and propriety were legally enforced. Laughter was not a private act. It was a socially regulated behavior, carrying real consequences. Roman law also extended its reach into the personal and domestic spheres, sometimes in the most ludicrous ways. Cornelia, a wealthy matron, had her dogs confiscated for feeding them in a public square. She argued that her small pets posed no threat, yet magistrates insisted that public feeding violated civic order. In another case, a parrot was seized because it repeatedly uttered words deemed offensive in the marketplace. These incidents reveal a society where even pets were subject to legal and moral oversight, and where public behavior, human or animal, was strictly monitored. Perhaps the most notorious scandals involved fashion and appearance. Purple was the color of emperors, and wearing it illegally could result in fines, public shaming, or even exile. One matron, Aemilia Scaura, cleverly wove thin purple threads into her hair to suggest status without technically violating the law. A young man, however, wore sandals embroidered with purple threads and was forced to stand publicly in plain footwear, declaring his transgression. In Rome, the clothing of a citizen was a statement of status, loyalty, and obedience, and violations were treated as civic offenses rather than personal choices. Religious violations, too, produced extraordinary cases. Unauthorized rituals or incorrect sacrifices could result in exile, fines, or public disgrace. A man performing rites on the Capitoline Hill without permission faced banishment, accused of threatening the city's safety through impiety. In another instance, citizens were fined for failing to attend mandatory ceremonies or for minor missteps during sacred festivals. Rome demonstrates a world in which religion, law, and civic duty were inseparable, and mistakes in any domain could produce scandalous consequences. Roman law also created tension in matters of family and social hierarchy. Fathers wielded patria potestas, the legal authority to punish,
disinherit or even execute their children, but courts sometimes intervened. One case involved a father attempting to sell his son into slavery for minor misconduct. The court ruled against him, citing the child's potential contribution to society. This conflict between legal authority, morality, and social expectation often produced highly publicized disputes, blending scandal, humor, and tragedy. Some of the most entertaining legal cases involved sumptuary restrictions on wealth display. Citizens were fined for decorating tombs excessively, hosting feasts with forbidden dishes, or even over-celebrating weddings and birthdays. These laws reflect both Rome's obsession with moderation and the social anxiety surrounding envy and hierarchy. In one extraordinary case, a wealthy merchant was fined not for the food itself, but for using gold leaf to garnish pastries, an act deemed a threat to social equilibrium. Enforcement often included public humiliation, making the lesson visible to all. The humor and absurdity of these laws are evident in the public spectacle they created. Citizens punished for minor offenses, laughing at funerals, wearing purple sandals, or feeding pets in public, became cautionary examples. Yet the spectacle also created opportunities for clever evasion. Matrons, merchants, and young men learned to navigate loopholes, obscure violations, and subtly bend rules. Life in Rome required constant calculation. One's gestures, dress, speech, and even emotional expression could carry legal, social, and moral weight. These cases highlight a society where law and daily life were inseparable, yet constantly tested by ingenuity and subtle rebellion.
Perhaps the most scandalous legal cases involved sexual misconduct, adultery, and social transgressions. Adultery carried harsh penalties, particularly when involving elites. A freed woman engaging in relations with a senator's son could face execution, while a man of equal social rank might escape with a fine. The differential enforcement of these laws underscores Rome's deep entanglement of social hierarchy with legal authority, producing both scandal and tension. Citizens were acutely aware that their actions could carry far-reaching consequences, and many navigated these rules with subtlety, cunning, and sometimes deception. Even trivial gestures were legally scrutinized. Citizens could be fined for snapping fingers disrespectfully, gesturing incorrectly during festivals, or making small social faux pas. One case involved a man fined for snapping his fingers during a religious procession, a gesture interpreted as disrespect. Another citizen faced penalties for over-enthusiastic nodding in the presence of magistrates. These rules, though absurd to modern sensibilities, reflect a society in which every action communicated status, intent, and morality. The cases of Roman law are remarkable not just for their absurdity, but for their human drama. Every transgression tells a story of social negotiation, fear, ingenuity, and resilience. Citizens faced with fines for minor offenses often learned to navigate the system creatively, balancing compliance with personal expression. The absurdity, humor, and shock of these cases remind us that law is never merely a static system. It is a living negotiation between authority and human nature. Even historians who study these cases are struck by the mix of comedy and gravity. Citizens fined for laughter, clothing, pets, or food illustrate the extraordinary reach of law into private life. Yet, within these constraints, Romans exercised ingenuity, humor, and adaptability. The legal system was simultaneously absurd and effective, punishing excess, regulating morality, and shaping daily behavior while allowing space for creativity and negotiation. Ultimately, the scandalous and humorous cases of Roman law illuminate enduring truths about human societies. They show that laws reflect the anxieties, priorities, and values of a civilization.
that enforcement can be both absurd and instructive, and that humans continually respond with creativity, cunning, and resilience. The stories of purple sandals, confiscated parrots, extravagant feasts, and emotional transgressions reveal a civilization obsessively concerned with order, yet endlessly inventive in practice. The most shocking and entertaining Roman legal cases remind us that law is more than punishment. It is culture, morality, and social narrative codified into action. Rome demonstrates the extremes to which authority can reach, the lengths to which humans will go to navigate restrictions, and the enduring tension between order and freedom. In these stories, humor, scandal, and social control intertwine, producing a historical record that fascinates, entertains, and instructs centuries later. Rome's legal absurdities, while sometimes laughable, reveal a civilization deeply aware of the power of regulation, symbolism, and morality. Citizens learned to live creatively within constraints, adapting to laws that reached into every corner of life. These stories continue to resonate today because they reflect universal human experiences: fear of punishment, desire for status, negotiation of social norms, and the boundless ingenuity of people confronted with rules that are as absurd as they are pervasive. In studying these scandalous, shocking, and humorous legal cases, we gain not just entertainment, but insight into the psychology of control, the importance of hierarchy, the interplay of law and morality, and the enduring resilience of the human spirit. Rome, in all its legal absurdity, reminds us that civilization is a delicate balance between regulation and creativity, authority and resistance, order and the unpredictable vitality of human life.
By the time the sun dipped behind the Capitoline Hill, casting its long shadow across the marble streets of Rome, the city seemed both majestic and meticulous. On one hand, it was a hub of power, art, and politics. On the other, it was a civilization bound by laws so pervasive, so meticulous, and at times so absurd that every gesture, word, and act was under scrutiny. These laws were not just instruments of punishment, they were instruments of culture, social engineering, and moral instruction. And while some rules may strike modern eyes as humorous or shocking, their influence on Roman culture, literature, and daily life was profound. One of the most striking ways Roman law shaped culture was through literature and satire. Authors like Juvenal, Martial, and Plautus wrote extensively about the absurdities of Roman life, often highlighting legal regulations and their social consequences. Juvenal, in particular, mocked the strictures of sumptuary laws, the social policing of wealth, and the ridiculous punishments for minor infractions, weaving these observations into biting satirical poems that entertained and instructed simultaneously. Martial's epigrams frequently targeted citizens who violated social and legal norms, ridiculing both their audacity and the consequences they faced. Literature thus became a mirror reflecting the tension between legal authority and human behavior, highlighting absurdities while preserving them in cultural memory. Satire and literature were not merely entertainment, they were a form of social commentary. Roman authors exaggerated the impact of laws on daily life, presenting citizens fined for wearing purple threads, feeding pets, or laughing at funerals as both ridiculous and tragic figures. These narratives reinforced social awareness, teaching readers about acceptable behavior while allowing them to laugh at the absurdity. In a sense, Roman law created its own cultural ecosystem. The stricter and more extreme the law, the richer the commentary, satire, and storytelling it inspired. Citizens, writers, and audiences engaged in a continuous dialogue, negotiating morality, humor, and legality through literary expression. The influence of law extended deeply into social norms and etiquette.
Citizens internalized legal rules in everyday life, shaping behavior in subtle but pervasive ways. Clothing choices, gestures, and speech were guided by laws regulating status, propriety, and ritual. The regulation of purple attire, for example, reinforced social hierarchy, reminding every citizen of the boundaries of rank and privilege. Sumptuary laws dictated acceptable displays of wealth and luxury, influencing fashion, architecture, and even domestic decoration. Rules regarding mourning, feasting, and public conduct normalized restraint, moderation, and decorum, embedding legal priorities into the very fabric of social interaction. Even humor and emotion were shaped by law. Fines for inappropriate laughter, excessive mourning, or disrespectful gestures ensured that citizens performed their emotions in accordance with societal expectations. In this way, law became a tool of psychological and social engineering, creating a culture where thought, behavior, and emotion were inseparable from legal and moral norms. Citizens learned to navigate these rules creatively, balancing compliance with personal expression. This dynamic produced not only ingenuity, but also a uniquely Roman form of self-awareness, an understanding that every action could be scrutinized, codified, and judged. Roman religion, tightly bound to law, further shaped culture. Ritual correctness, participation in public ceremonies, and proper observance of civic religious duties were all legally mandated. Failures could result in exile, fines, or public disgrace. This integration of religion and law reinforced the notion that civic and spiritual life were inseparable, influencing architecture, festivals, and communal rituals. Temples, altars, and public ceremonies were not merely places of worship, they were stages on which citizens demonstrated their legal and moral compliance. The absurdity of minor infractions, improper gestures, small mistakes in ritual, or failing to attend mandated festivals reinforced the omnipresence of law in cultural and spiritual life. Roman law also shaped education, raising generations of citizens attuned to social, moral, and legal expectations. Boys learned patrician norms, civic duties, and ritual performance, while girls were educated in domestic management, social propriety, and the subtle navigation of sumptuary and mourning laws. This education emphasized that law was not separate from life, it was life itself. Children internalized rules that regulated dress, behavior, and emotional expression, growing up aware of the boundaries of acceptability, yet often learning how to negotiate or circumvent them.
The legal regulation of daily life also had profound economic and commercial implications. Merchants, innkeepers, and artisans had to comply with rules governing trade, display of goods, and sumptuary limitations. Luxury items, exotic foods, and imported products were regulated to prevent social imbalance and moral decay. Those who transgressed faced fines, confiscation, and public humiliation. As a result, commerce became a field not only of profit, but of careful negotiation with legal and social constraints. The economy, in this sense, was inseparable from morality and law, a balance between opportunity and compliance that shaped Roman society as profoundly as any political edict. Humor, absurdity, and scandal were central to cultural life because Roman laws frequently created situations that tested citizens' ingenuity and adaptability. The stories of fines for parrot speech, purple sandals, or excessive feasts were retold, exaggerated, and immortalized in public memory. They became social touchstones, illustrating the boundaries of acceptable behavior, entertaining audiences, and creating a shared cultural narrative. Citizens engaged in a subtle performance, balancing compliance with creativity, understanding that law was both a constraint and an arena for social maneuvering. Moreover, Roman laws reveal the psychology of power and obedience.
extreme regulations over trivial matters, such as gestures, clothing, or pets, cultivated a society in which self-regulation was internalized. Citizens anticipated consequences, adjusted behavior proactively, and negotiated social and legal hierarchies daily. Humor, ingenuity, and subtle defiance were essential tools for survival in a world where even the smallest misstep could carry legal, social, or spiritual consequences. The extreme and sometimes absurd nature of Roman law also influenced public spectacle and entertainment. The Forum became both a civic center and a stage where social norms were enforced. Public apologies, fines, and punishments were visible to all, creating lessons in morality and compliance while entertaining observers. Festivals, markets, and religious ceremonies were infused with the tension of law, creating a society where citizens performed their lives within a framework of expectation, scrutiny, and consequence. In modern terms, Roman law illustrates the power of legal frameworks to shape culture, psychology, and social behavior. While we may laugh at fines for laughter, pets, or clothing, the underlying principle remains timeless. Laws do not merely punish, they teach, guide, and codify values. Rome demonstrates that culture, morality, and social norms are inseparable from legal structures. Literature, satire, public rituals, and even fashion were all intertwined with statutes, creating a civilization where the absurd and the serious coexisted, influencing generations of citizens and leaving a legacy that endures to this day. Finally, the fascination with Roman law lies not only in its extreme or humorous cases, but in the insights it provides into human behavior. Citizens navigated hierarchy, morality, and authority, balancing compliance with ingenuity. They faced absurdity with creativity, embraced social expectations, and continually negotiated the tension between law and personal expression. These stories remind modern audiences that law is not simply about punishment, it is a mirror of society, a tool for education, and a stage for the drama of human life.